Bleak House. The Charles Dickens Children's Collection. Esther. There was once a young girl called Esther Summerson. Esther had never known her mother or father. She lived with Miss Barbary, her aunt. Miss Barbary was a horribly strict woman who never smiled or spoke kindly to Esther. Esther had a lot of questions about her parents. Her aunt never answered them. She only mentioned Esther's mother once, on Esther's birthday. Miss Barbary told Esther that it would have been better if she hadn't been born. She said Esther's mother was a disgrace. An utter disgrace, she shouted at Esther. You should forget all about your useless parents. Esther was miserable and lonely. She didn't often meet other children. Even when she did, her aunt forbade her from playing with them. The only friend Esther had in the world was her doll. Sometimes she would cry herself to sleep, holding the doll to her cheek. Esther also had a little white handkerchief. It had the letters HB embroidered on it in blue thread. She treasured it because she believed it once belonged to her mother. Then, one day, everything changed. When Esther was 14, her aunt died suddenly. A kind man called John Jarndyce became her guardian. He sent Esther to a boarding school. Here, for the first time in her life, Esther made friends. She was happy. After 6 joyful years at school, Esther received a letter. Mr. Jarndyce wanted her to come and stay at his house in the country. It was called Bleak House. Esther was worried it would live up to its name. Mr. Jarndyce was also the guardian to 2 other young people, Ada Clare and Richard Carstone. They were very distant members of his family. He wanted them to come to Bleak House as well. Esther, Ada and Richard met in London, before traveling together to Mr. Jarndyce's home. Ada had thick golden hair and soft blue eyes. She was very friendly. Esther soon felt as if they had known each other for a long time. Richard was nice, too. He was a cheerful young man who didn't take life too seriously. It was a cold, frosty evening when the 3 finally arrived. The house they were traveling to lay just outside the town of St. Albans. But Bleak House didn't look bleak at all. Candlelight sparkled from its windows and warmth spilled 12 out of the front door. Their guardian, John Jarndyce, was there to greet them. He couldn't have been more welcoming. Ada, my love, Esther, my dear, you are welcome here, said Mr. Jarndyce. He hugged them. I am so happy to see you. Richard, if I had a hand to spare, I would shake yours. John Jarndyce was a silver-haired man, with a face full of kindness. Like its owner, his house was warm and welcoming, and certainly not bleak. But John Jarndyce explained that it had once been bleak indeed. Bleak House had been left to John by an uncle, Tom Jarndyce. This uncle had spent his life fighting in a legal case called Jarndyce and Jarndyce. This case was many, many years old. The Jarndyce and Jarndyce case was about a will. A long time ago, someone called Jarndyce had left a lot of money to someone else called Jarndyce. But a third person in the Jarndyce family claimed he ought to have the money. Then a 4th person said the same thing, and then a 5th, and a 6th, and so on. The argument had gone on for so many years that no one could remember how it started. Lawyers argued. Different lawyers made different arguments. Judges made judgments. Different judges made different judgments. Everyone went round and round in circles. The case was never ending. But some members of the Jarndyce family still hoped that one day they might get the money. Old Tom Jarndyce spent his whole life reading legal papers. He went to court again and again. The court was in the middle of London, so he traveled a lot. Meanwhile, Bleak House was falling to pieces. The wind whistled through the cracked walls, and rain fell through the roof. After Tom died, John Jarndyce started to put things right. He had the roof and walls repaired. He turned Bleak House into a cheerful, welcoming home. John had a word of advice for his young wards, Ada, Richard, and Esther. Never get involved in the Jarndyce and Jarndyce case. It is a curse, not a blessing. It will destroy your lives. Lady Dedlock. Lady Dedlock was involved with the Jarndyce and Jarndyce case. She and her husband, Sir Leicester Dedlock, owned a house in the countryside. It was much larger and grander than Bleak House. The only problem was that Lady Dedlock found the countryside very boring. There was nothing to do there. Especially when it was stormy and wet. The Dedlocks spent days sitting and watching the rain. Finally, they'd had enough. We simply must go back to London, moaned Lady Dedlock to her husband. I cannot watch another raindrop run down another window pane, I'll go mad. And so, they went. Sir Leicester and Lady Dedlock travelled to their house in London. There was more excitement. One day, a lawyer called Mr. Tulkinghorn came to see them. He had some information he wanted to show the Dedlocks. Mr. Tulkinghorn was a hard-faced, sharp-nosed man. He worked on the Jarndyce and Jarndyce case. He also liked finding out secrets about the important people he worked for. Knowing their secrets gave him power over them, and he loved power. It was a cold, wet, gloomy afternoon and Lady Dedlock sat on a sofa by the fire. She wasn't interested in what Mr. Tulkinghorn had to say. She glanced lazily over at the papers he had brought with him. Lady Dedlock's blood ran cold. She thought she recognized one of the handwritten papers lying on a table nearby. It couldn't be, could it? She stood up. Who wrote that? She asked Mr. Tulkinghorn. I don't know, replied the lawyer. There are men paid to copy out these documents. They are called law writers. Why do you ask, my lady? Lady Dedlock waved an elegant hand in the air as if to show her question didn't matter. The rings on her hand sparkled in the firelight. She sat back down. But the question did matter. Mr. Tulkinghorn saw how Lady Dedlock's eyes kept darting back to the paper on the table. It was obvious to Mr. Tulkinghorn that Lady Dedlock recognized the handwriting. Suddenly, the color drained from Lady Dedlock's face. She said she thought she might faint. Sir Leicester summoned Hortense, her maid, who helped her to bed. Lady Dedlock's husband was worried about his wife. He didn't notice anything odd about the way she had acted though. He was much older than her and his sight and his hearing weren't so sharp. As they finished their meeting, Mr. Tulkinghorn couldn't help thinking about what had happened. It was clear that Lady Dedlock had a secret and he liked collecting secrets. He decided to find out who had copied out the legal document that she was so curious about. Mr. Tulkinghorn investigates. Mr. Tulkinghorn went to the office where his legal papers were copied. He discovered that the work had been done by someone called Nemo. Nemo? That was strange. Nemo was the Latin word for nobody. Mr. Tulkinghorn learned that Nemo lived close by. He rented a room above a junk shop. It was nighttime by now, but Mr. Tulkinghorn was determined to visit the man. Who was he? And why had Lady Dedlock reacted so strangely to the sight of his handwriting? The owner of the junk shop, Mr. Crook, told Mr. Tulkinghorn that he hardly ever saw Nemo. "Shall I call him down, sir?" "I don't think he'll answer though. He might as well be dead. He keeps himself to himself, does Mr. Nemo." "I'll go up to him then," replied Mr. Tulkinghorn. "Second floor, sir. It's dark up there. Take this candle." Mr. Tulkinghorn nodded and went up the narrow stairs. He reached the dark door on the second floor. He knocked. No answer. He opened the door and accidentally blew out his candle in doing so. The small room was almost black with soot and dirt. A candle burnt low on a broken desk. Mr. Tulkinghorn could also see a couple of chairs and a low bed. There was a man lying on the bed. He was dressed in a dirty shirt and ragged trousers, with bare feet. His hair and beard were tangled. A couple of empty bottles lay on the floor next to the bed. "Hello, my friend," shouted Mr. Tulkinghorn, banging his iron candlestick against the door. The man did not move and did not answer. Mr. Tulkinghorn shouted again. Still the man on the bed did not move, and still he did not answer. Mr. Tulkinghorn called for a doctor, but it was too late. Nemo was dead. He was not old, but drink and poverty had hastened his death. Mr. Crook, Nemo's landlord, complained that the dead man owed him 6 weeks' rent. Only one person seemed sorry about Nemo's death. He was a young lad called Joe. Joe couldn't read or write and he slept on the streets. He vid Bensfier earned a small amount of money from rich ladies who would pay him to sweep the roads before they crossed them. Nemo had been kind to Joe. Even though he had almost no money himself, he would always give a penny or two to the boy. Now Joe sobbed. He wished he'd told Nemo just how much his help had meant. Mr. Tulkinghorn stood by and watched. He wondered again why Lady Dedlock was so startled to see Nemo's handwriting. Mr. Tulkinghorn would have wondered even more if he had seen what happened a few weeks later. One evening, a woman found Joe the sweeper sitting in a shop doorway. She asked the lad about his friend, the man called Nemo. Joe was a little frightened. He couldn't see the woman's face beneath her hat and her veil. He could only hear her soft voice. She certainly sounded like a lady, but she was dressed in plain clothes, like a servant. She said she would pay Joe to take her to the house where Nemo had died.